KwaZulu-Natal Education MEC Mshengu says the Education Department does not have the budget to hire more security guards. He was visiting Dussenhoek High School in Pinetown following the stabbing of 4 pupils by robbers. Addressing parents and community members at the school, Mshengu said that communities also have the responsibility of guarding schools. The robbers broke into the school premises yesterday and demanded valuables from teachers and learners. It said that the learners stood up to the robbers when they were stabbed.
Actually had 2 guards. Obviously, one of them was not at work yesterday, but it's a reasonable security that you can put in any school in KwaZulu-Natal. We have employed a number of what we call community safety volunteers who are assisting with security matters in our schools. We continue to fence our schools, but we are clear that as long as we don't win this battle in our communities, our schools will continue to be soft targets.
All right, now let's discuss these and other crime-related stories. We're now joined via Zoom by Siphelele Ngobese, inclusion and well-being researcher at the South African Cities Network. Siphelele, thank you so much for your time this afternoon. Now, my question, especially after just seeing that report about the 4 learners who were stabbed while at school by robbers. The question obviously at the top of everyone's mind is, are police having a handle on crime in this country?
Thank you for having me, first of all. I would say that it's a twin issue. It's an issue of policing, of course, but I'd like to focus more on the all of society aspects and the conditions that are structural, economic, spatial, that drive crime and violence in our country. And of course, our schools are microcosmic of what's going on in the country more broadly. I heard the commentary from someone who was being interviewed in the clip just now, and they made a very, very, very important point around schools as community assets and the idea that perhaps more security and more policing would help to alleviate some of the challenges. Of course, not to understate the gravity of a stabbing at a school, but to say that perhaps hybrid and together with interventions that are policing and security based, we also need to look at the broader social aspects and the broader impacts of in some cases how far as communities we have become removed from our own assets. And I would like to support that point that says that together with more security, together with more law enforcement-based responses, we need to look at how we can stimulate that love of community assets among our communities and that community ownership of great assets and places and centers of learning, such as schools.
Now, I hear that part where we all need to work together, but of concern here is obviously now that we are seeing the level of violence that we are currently experiencing and seeing in society is now spilled over into schools. So that to me is concerning, and it's actually at this point reaching a crisis level because you heard the KZN MEC for Education saying there that schools just don't have enough budget to protect to protect not only the facilities themselves, but also the learners and the teachers, and so the question then is, to what end can we stop this violence that we are seeing at schools so that it doesn't and shouldn't mimic what we are currently seeing in society, because even in that space, I think we're failing.
Yes, I must agree with you on your observation around having reached a crisis point, and our schools also existing within our society so they wouldn't be kind of spared from the things that we see happening in our own communities. However, I do take the point of the Department of Basic Education that says that it doesn't have the budget to necessarily be able to deal with these issues as they emerge. So I think I would reinforce the point of, in one sense, in my opening statement, I mentioned something around all of society approaches and us coming closer to our community assets. I think I would also propose an all of government approach where the mandate to educate and to govern schools should be an all of government effort. Where does policing come into play? Where do programs that address the risk factors that drive crime and violence, even within schools, even among students themselves, because maybe unrelated to this particular incident, our own data shows that youth, young people are as much at risk to become victims of crime, and at the same time, they tend to be the perpetrators of crime, especially young men. So how do you orient and how do you educate and how do you foster resilience and foster communities not just to cope but to thrive? And so I think it requires, in the absence of budgets to pay for policing and security, how can the South African Police Service come to the table to support the Department of Basic Education? So it requires sound intergovernmental relations and interdepartmental relations and partnerships that need to come into play. There's also a role for not-for-profit organizations, a role for civil society organizations to also come to the table to kind of come up with dynamic and interdisciplinary approaches to crime and violence.
Siphelele, I'm wondering how much of your research, focusing at crime and violence, have to do with inequality, just looking at where these crimes occur most of the times at these particular schools, even at various communities around the country?
It certainly has much to do with poverty, inequality. Our research and our findings really advance this point around crime and violence, particularly in urban areas, being something that has structural drivers, and those structural drivers have a lot to do with inequality. I did mention in the beginning that the key drivers of crime, as we have observed, they are social, they are economic, and they are also spatial. And so it's important to think about some of the infrastructural resources that can act as protective barriers against violence, also economic investments, and also social investments. And so we advance a point around social crime prevention to say that sometimes it's also about attitudes in a society. To what extent have we come to accept some forms of violence as just normal, and how can we educate ourselves and educate each other in terms of shifting our attitudes to certain things? It's also about addressing the broader paradigm of vulnerability that we face in society, particularly among youth and young people, and to what extent do what we are seeing manifest in our society and of course in our schools that exist very much within society, to what extent do those reflect the vulnerabilities that are the broader issues? And we need to offer more support to high-risk schools using transformative approaches to enable learners not only to cope but to thrive, as I mentioned, and in upscaling those interventions, I think it's something that needs to happen within broader society as well.
Siphelele, I would imagine another focal point for you and the work that you do is look at crime statistics. We are exposed to these ever so often as South Africans. And I'm wondering, are they really a true reflection of what is currently happening on the ground and the work that you do and some of the communities that you are exposed to?
Yes. So we are awaiting the aggregation of the most recent crime statistics to the city level so we can have a clear picture of how what we are seeing reported at the national level is playing out at the local level, meaning at the municipal level, at the metropolitan city level as well. Right now, I would be speaking to what we have observed from the previous release of crime stats and the aggregation thereof. And so we are waiting with bated breath to see what the picture looks like for 2021. However, of course, I think it's consistent. As I mentioned, urban centers are areas of particular concern based on our observations. The lion's share of particular crime types, such as car hijackings, break-ins, and the more violent forms of crime are being observed among the 9 major metros of our cities. And it goes back to the point we were making earlier around crime and violence being issues that are intrinsic to and inextricable from the economic, from issues of inequality, from social attitudes and from space. And what we are seeing is that our urban spaces continue to enable crime and violence in certain ways, the structure of our economies as well, and also our social attitudes. So those are some of the observations, the broader observations we've made. In terms of the objective and what relates to the crime statistics that are based on reported crimes, we are seeing that, well, it's differentiated. It depends where you are in the country. And so it's important to understand what the specific drivers in each place are. In some areas, it may be related to migration factors, whereas in others, it may be related to alcohol and access to illicit arms, whereas in others, the most prevalent forms of crime may relate to family disruption. So it's important to also have interventions that speak to the household level. And in saying that, of course, this is the ambit and the level at which local or municipal government is responsible. However, I would go back to the point I made around partnerships, around sound intergovernmental and interdisciplinary and cross-departmental collaboration to kind of deal with the issues holistically.
Siphelele, thank you so much for that comprehensive, study that you are doing as a researcher at the South African Cities Network. We really do appreciate you spending some time with us. Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Siphelele Ngobese, talking about crime in South Africa there, and of course crime in South African schools now. She is from the South African Cities Network, and she is an inclusion and well-being researcher there. Well, SA Today continues right after this. Stay with us.